name is Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
I hope I pronounce her name properly. Thais Gibson.
I am so excited for you to be here with me today. Thank you for joining us. Welcome, Jemma. I am so excited that you're here. I feel like you and I sit down and we never really have enough time to talk through everything because I feel like we really get into all of the topics, all of the discussions. And what I'm most excited about is just to share with listeners about your incredible launch to success and really being in this powerful niche of helping people in their 20s navigate themselves, their self-identity, psychology. So if you can just kick it off by sharing a little bit about your backstory and what got you into building your incredibly successful podcast to begin with.
Yeah, thank you again for having me as well. I feel like the listeners need to realize that we've done a couple of episodes together, and that is only about half the content because we just talk so long. Even before we started recording, we were talking about tonsillitis and so many and just the weirdest things. But yeah, my name is Jemma. Thank you for the introduction. And I run the podcast, The Psychology of Your 20s. And it is my baby. It is my little child. I launched it back in 2021. And I used the word launch, but at the time it wasn't even that. It was me, a launch suggests something with a lot of fanfare. It was genuinely just me this person still in uni at the time who had this love for psychology and was experiencing her 20s and was, talking to my friends about their lives and the application of the research to their lives. And I was like, I'm going to just do this because if I don't do it, I could just tell I would regret it. It was just this strange sense that I needed to do this. And, I'd just been through a breakup. I honestly think that breakups are so sacred for creating new versions of yourself and for having really creative, fascinating ideas and the motivation to do them. And genuinely was just, there's this metaphor that from, I think it's ancient Greece or ancient Rome, that's creativity and inspiration is a gust of wind, and you have to be prepared to just go with it. You never know when you're going to get taken by the wind. And the people who, make their dreams a reality are those who just run with the wind, let it take them where it needs to go. And I guess that's kind of just what happened. I had this idea and I launched it from the back of my car. That's where I recorded my first ever episode. And then the second episode was on my friend's bedroom floor. And it was just, such humble beginnings for this little show.
I love that. So obviously you probably never expected it to reach as many people as it has in such a short period of time. Is it sort of that you had that pull, that knowing where it was so strong you couldn't ignore it sort of feeling?
Yeah, it literally exactly that. And I remember having this sense of the least I can say is that I did it. If everything else fails, if literally nothing happens. And I really didn't think that anything was going to happen. I really had no concept of what it meant to have a big podcast. It's so strange. I had no idea. I really did not think it would ever get big. I just wanted to do it. And I remember being this is just, I don't want to say that I had an idea and I didn't go through with it, because that's just such a terrible way to live life, is to live in this state of regret that your life could have been different if you hadn't done something. And it's so strange now because I've never experienced that before or since, and it really did feel quite a calling in quite a spiritual way. And I don't know, I'm not somebody who is I wouldn't call myself a very enlightened or highly spiritual person, but that was a really pretty powerful moment during that time.
It's so funny because I've had so many amazing conversations with people over the past, few years and having people on our podcast or chatting with people on podcasts. And there's always the same kind of dynamic where when somebody had really quick success, I find that there's this like almost in your heart, like this deep sense of like, I need to do this. And the pull is so strong that it's almost like they can't ignore it any further. And so they have
Mm.
this really, really deep sense of let me just do this with no expectations. And it's always those types of situations that I've seen really, really grow quickly. So that's so cool to hear. And what is the dynamic? I love that you said, by the way, that breakups are sacred in creating new versions of yourself. I couldn't agree more on that.
Mm.
That's a beautiful thing to touch on, and we can come back to that. But what was your big fascination with psychology? Was it just like a hobby and a passion, or was there something from your roots, like in childhood or your upbringing, that really caused you to be super interested and fascinated?
That is such a good question. I think that, so I studied it. I was studying at uni, and I was also working in that space at the time that I launched the show. I was actually working in child maltreatment, so child neglect and abuse, which is quite sad. And I was working as part of this huge study in Australia to understand how those experiences in childhood like created who we were as adults and created basically like health problems as adults. And so that was where like a lot of the fascination came from. And I think ever since I was a child, I just was genuinely really, really interested in people and what they were thinking and what they were doing and why they were acting like that, what made them do things. And also being a child who was like, I was just a very lonely child because I was a little bit different. I was super weird. And I love that I was, because I have this saying, I think I've said this to you before, but I do think that like strange children make interesting adults because they never have to seek out the external validation of others. Like they know what it means to just like be their own company. And I was kind of just a weird child. I just did strange things. And yeah, I think that's what really led to like my fascination with psychology. It was like, this is a better way to understand other people and also to better understand myself and maybe feel more connected and feel like I know more. And so I did it in high school because you can do, I don't know if you can in Canada, but in Australia, you can study it in high school. And then I did my degree, and then I worked in the space. And it was around that time as I was finishing up that I launched the psychology of your 20s.
Wow, that's so cool to hear. And I totally agree with you that when kids grow up and they are their own company because they've had to go their own way a little bit, even through some people's experiences of feeling like an outsider or feeling like they don't belong in some sort of way or they can't connect in the way that they want to, there's this like really powerful silver lining in that if people are willing to look, which is that you individuate at a younger age. And so you have this deeper sense of self of like knowing who you are. So I really like that quote because I hear that in exactly what you're saying. So on the topic of loneliness, as you sort of mentioned, you were more of a lonely child, and what were your roots that created that sense of loneliness? Was it just in school, or was it also in the home? And why is this topic so near and dear to your heart?
So I think it's for a couple of reasons. The first one, like I think all of this does come back to, family in a sense. Probably it was probably kind of like 60% of why I think I felt so lonely. So I have siblings now. I have two sisters, but they're quite younger than me. They're actually same age distance as you and your sister, so 7 and 9 years, I think. So my parents like really struggled to have more children after me. It was so interesting because I was literally talking to my dad about it last night and was like, oh, I don't know how it got brought up. But he was telling me, it was like, no, we really wanted you to have siblings, but we just couldn't until my sisters came along. So I think that was like a component of it. And also my mum was working so much. She was always like out of the house. She was always overseas. She was always doing her own things. And like at the same time, my dad had, I think really was struggling with his mental health. And I just remember like being a kid and being like, oh, I guess maybe this is also where the fascination came from, being like having conversations with, like having conversations with like the other grown-ups in my life. And then like saying things to me that I didn't quite understand. I remember like my aunt once was like, oh, you must really miss your parents. And I was like, well, they're right here. But like, it was this sense of like, oh, maybe there's something else going on. And then because I think, I was really lucky because my extended family is quite big. So that was great, like that I got to see them quite regularly. But then I went to school, and I don't think I really talk about this much, but I was quite like an overweight child. And so I think that I was really, I don't think I know, I was really bullied by these other kids. And like, I remember really, really revealing myself here, but I remember watching a movie at like after school care because my mom was working. And it was maybe The Princess Bride or some movie with this young girl in it. And this kid goes to me, "Oh, you would look so much like her if you weren't fat." And I was like 7 years old, and I still remember to this day like that whole experience. So I think, and then it just felt, and because I didn't have much self-confidence, it was harder for me to want to be around other kids and like to want to speak up and to want to like
Engage and get in there.
engage. Exactly. Yeah, and like want to play because I was like, oh, I'm so embarrassed. And so I think that's where it really came from. I was pretty lonely because I just was kind of like, I don't know, probably scared, probably just used to it. But like, it's interesting because I was lonely, and I do remember being lonely, but I was also really happy at other times as well. I was like, really liked doing my own thing, really liked reading, really liked running about by myself.
I think that's sort of peacefulness and that to do your own thing. That's really beautiful. It's funny because kids can be so harsh, right? Kids can be
Oh my
so
God.
cruel and harsh. And of course, they don't necessarily mean to be in like this negative way, but it, I feel like that's just kids in their childhood development and behavioral development. But it's so common, I think, for people to remember these deeply ingrained moments where we feel like left out or we feel shamed in some sort of way. And so, it makes so much sense. And thank you for sharing all of that.
Do you have a moment like that though? Like,
I have a
did you
moment
have
that
something like
comes
that?
to mind really, really strongly. So I think as well, it's funny. So because my sister is 7 and a bit years younger as well. I was the only child, and my father was very, very strict. So I wasn't allowed to like do a lot of things with other kids. And so I wasn't like, I almost feel like I wasn't really socialized until a little bit later in life, like in a normal way. And it's funny because I wonder if these are like some of the roots. And I have this memory, and I actually thought about this when we were talking. I was thinking, oh, like kids and that sort of feeling of being like an outsider or not belonging. And I remember being in like second grade class, and I guess we had like recess inside. Maybe there was like a storm or something. And I remember all the kids playing, and I felt like I didn't know how to like approach the kids and play with them. And I remember like sitting in the corner and pretending to play, but I was like just trying to pretend to play so that I felt like so that I felt like I like sort of fit in some kind of way. And really I was so sad, and I was like looking down so no one would see me, but I was crying, and I felt like so like sort of excluded from the other kids. And it's funny, but I feel like I wasn't, because I was an only child for the first little while and I didn't really get a lot of time with other kids. I almost feel like for really until like third or fourth grade, I felt very like an outsider, and like I really didn't belong. And I was very sensitive. And so I would really like take things to heart as well when I was young. Like I would cry at everything all the time. So I also was nervous at the age to like get my feelings hurt. So, it's just so interesting, but I think being a little kid like that is tough if you don't have like a really good support system. And if you don't have siblings closer in age, you're not doing stuff where your parents socialize you a ton, because you can easily feel kind of, like you don't belong in that kind of way.
Yeah. It is the socialization, right? But I honestly also believe that it's children who are like overly sensitive, or like I said, a little bit weird or isolated, that have a lot of empathy for other people and they're like become interesting. But like, I think when you have that part of you that knows what it's like to be excluded or to not belong from such an early age, you really grow up with this sense of like, I never want somebody else to experience that. It's like kind of crazy. It's like, whoa.
I totally relate to that. I used to literally say to people like, I went through some like hard, tricky times in as a teenager, and like really, really tough stuff for me. And I was like, I will never let anybody go through this again. And I would tell myself that all the time. Like, if I make it through this, I'll never let somebody go through this. And It's funny. I feel like there's like this innate sense that when you go through hardship, you don't want to see other people, going through some of those same experiences and circumstances.
Exactly. Because it's like, and it's really interesting because I was talking to somebody about this in terms of like criticism on the internet, right? Which I'm sure like you've experienced. I've experienced it. It's pretty rough. And I was like, you can always tell the person who hasn't processed their own hardship and their own insecurity and their own stuff, their own baggage, because they're often the first person who like lashes out. And I think it's like you have two parts, right? Like either you become overly empathetic, sometimes like a people pleaser, overly emotive, overly attuned to other people's feelings, or you just are angry and want to make everybody else like feel the pain that maybe you felt, feel like the dissatisfaction. I don't know.
No,
That's
I totally agree. And I want to dive into the topic of loneliness and your take on loneliness and how to really heal from it. But I will just speak that for one last moment, which is, I think as well, like underneath anger is hurt. And I think when we can't really like get in touch with the hurt because we're not allowed to cry or it's weak to show our emotions or whatever sort of ideas we're conditioned to believe, I think that anger becomes the next closest expression for a lot of people, is like when we can't feel our own hurt and we can't bear to really sit in that type of emotion, it feels a little safer to some degree to just express it out as anger, to lash out because it gives us that relief. But it's like you're never actually solving the problem of what hurt you. But underneath there, I think underneath anger really is just pain and suffering for people.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I'm on the same page.
So let's talk about loneliness. It's really powerful that you shared that growing up, and I'm sure it's a huge part of what makes you such an inquisitive person, and somebody who's dived so deeply into so many different psychological topics. But what is your take on why people are struggling so much with loneliness now? And what are some things that you've seen really work for you and for others in terms of what we can do about this?
Mm. Huge, like multi-million-dollar questions, honestly, because I feel like it is a loneliness epidemic at the moment. And, a lot of people will point to the very, like, I think the basic answers of like social media, the pandemic as well, like created these years, these like empty years for so many of us. But I honestly think that it's a broader factor of like a lack of community. And if you think about it, like back in the old days, like back even, 30 years ago, there was so much more that connected us. There were so many more places of coming together, so many more like community orientated things, whether that was sport or even like religion and church, and how much that had played a much more prominent place in people's lives, whether that was something that you wanted to partake in or not. And then of course, like having environments where, people, weren't on their phones. There was a greater tendency to want to interact and want to speak, and, that was the thing that you did like on the bus or, in the library or wherever. I just think all of this has led to a lot of us feeling very, very separated from other people. And it's really important to remember that humans thrive on community. The majority of us need like sustainable, stable, secure socialization. There's a alliteration for you. Like we need that quite constantly. And when we are unable to find that, it is like a physical pain, it is a physical wanting. And something that I always say to people is that loneliness is much like hunger, and it's much like thirst and tiredness. It is this like innate biological, sociological, psychological instinct that is telling us that some need that we have is not being met. And that is a need to belong. So I think that's like the big reason why we are experiencing more loneliness. And in terms of like what we can do about it.
Can we pause there for a second too? Because you said so many really interesting things. I want to take a moment.
I was like, should we pause on that?
I just wanted to pop in here and let you know we are doing a 7-day free trial to the All Access Membership Pass at PDS, which means you get access to literally everything inside of the school. And this includes the 4 live webinars I do with our students every single week. And on top of that, you get access to all of our different courses. We have over 55 different courses on relationships, communication, boundaries, emotional mastery, guilt and shame, learning your needs, so many different facets that are really important to master our lives and feel really good about our lives going forward. And last but not least, there's a daily community event. We have trained facilitators and coaches who are in there doing that work, showing up to support you on your journey every single day. Please join me on the other side. Come check it out. See if it's a fit for you. I'd love to see you there. Go ahead and sign up by clicking the link in the description box below.
So I want to ask you something, and I have my own opinion about this, but I know a lot of people who are very introverted, and they would say, yeah, well, that's for extroverts. What are your thoughts about that? Because I have some thoughts too, but I want to hear what you have to say.
Yeah. See, this is the thing. I think it's true that introverts, might need less socialization, or just like their threshold for what is fulfilling might be lower. It doesn't mean that the bar is at 0.
Yes.
Do you know what I mean? So it's like they do it, and I'm not an introvert, but my partner is an introvert. And it's really interesting because for a while I was like really worried about him. I was like, you never see your friends. Like, what's going on? Like, are you lonely? Are you lonely? And I remember he must have been so annoyed, but I would constantly ask him because for me, I need to see like multiple people sometimes a day. Otherwise I'm like, I have no friends. And it's a problem. It's a whole thing. I think it does, like, I know how terrible it feels to be lonely, and I never want to feel that again. So that's like a whole neuroses, but I would constantly ask him. And I just, began to realize that no, he gets a lot of energy from spending time alone, the way that I get energy from spending time with other people. But it doesn't mean that he doesn't need it. And I'm obviously, I'm not obvious to anyone listening, you obviously know this, but I'm in London at the moment. And so he is like spending a lot of time at home by himself. And he did say to me, he was like, yeah, I did feel really lonely this weekend. Oh. So I know it was literally like somebody stabbing me in the heart, but it was like, I don't think that, you know what I mean? Like, I don't think that just because you're an introvert means that you're a hermit. I think it's just that perhaps you need more nourishment. Like for you, I don't know if you're an introvert or not. Like for me, I need some of those filler interactions. Like I need to talk to my neighbor when I come home. I need to know, like, I need to have a chat at the grocery store. I need to call my friend when I'm at the gym. An introvert might only need one of those things.
Yes. I love that. I love how you said that. So I actually am technically an introvert. I know I seem like an extrovert. Nobody believes me when I say this, but I'm an INFJ. They say INFJs seem like extroverts. But so my husband is very, very introverted. He's great with people, like you would never know, but he definitely likes his time alone. And we work well that way because we'll do our own thing and then we'll come together. We'll like hang out in the same room and like read different books or, like we like function really well together that way. But, it's so funny because I love people. I have this like deep love for people. Very, I just naturally like gravitate towards people. But for me, my version of that as somebody who's like mildly introverted is I like one-on-one things more, or I like small groups. Like I definitely feel more drained by like a large group of people, or if there's like, like 20 people at a social gathering, like that, I'll like tap out a little bit quicker and I'll feel it draining my energy after a while. But like 1 or 2 people or people I'm close with, or small groups of people, 3, 4, like things like that, that's like, I love that. And it's funny because I think that it's like, it sort of speaks into how I think a lot of people use the excuse like, oh, I'm an introvert, to like never really spend time with people. And I actually think that sometimes it's like them coping from their own negative beliefs or stories, like of I'll be disliked or I'll be rejected or things like that. Not in my husband's case, but like people that I've seen in the past as clients and it's like people think that, oh yeah, like or sometimes you even see like this, it's like a joke and I see it online and stuff, but it's like sometimes you'll see like Reddit threads or posts of like, oh, I hate people or, stuff like that. And it's like, I think we just become afraid of people if we have limiting beliefs about ourselves around them, or if we've had negative experiences. And so I think sometimes then people will be like, no, I'm an introvert, I don't need people. And it's like, well, maybe you just need a different way of interacting with people in smaller groups or with people you feel more comfortable with, rather than trying to write off this idea that we need people. And I feel like we have this society that's become like so, promoting of being hyper independent and doing everything yourself. And while I'm a big proponent of like individuation and like us finding our own self identity and figuring out who we are, I think that doesn't mean go be alone and avoid people,
Yeah.
spend time there. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that.
You know what? I'm going to say this. I say this in every conversation we have. I totally agree. I was listening back to an episode that we did previously, and I'm always like, yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. Same page. Because it is the case, right? Where it's, and you know what? I see this a lot where people are like, well, I just don't like people. Like, I'm just not a people person. I'm a black cat. Like, I push people away. And you know what? I trust that they know themselves. But I'm also sometimes like, have you just created this identity because the opposite of actually wanting people and wanting connection and wanting community and not being able to find it is worse? And so you convince yourself that, you don't need those things because that way you don't have to look for them. And that way you don't have to be rejected. And that way you don't have to confront the fact that, no, you are actually quite lonely. And I will speak to this from a personal point of view. I remember when I was 19, so I was like very lonely, very alone in some ways. Like, I had friends in high school, but they weren't really people, like I don't stay in touch with any of them. Like we didn't have a deep friendship. And then I went on like some vacation, literally didn't see any of them ever again. And when I went to uni, it was like my first experience of like meeting my people, like you said. Sometimes I thought I was an introvert. Sometimes you just have to meet your people. And the summer after my first year at uni, I remember I went through this breakup because I dated somebody like in the friendship group, which was very silly. And I lost all of those friends.
Oh,
and it was really hard because I was devastated and I wasn't that much fun to be around and they weren't really my real friends. So, and I remember being like, well, this is who I am. I knew it all along. I was an introvert. That's why I lost these friendships. That's why like this didn't work out. It's because I'm not meant to be around people. And I think it was me just trying to make peace with the circumstances that I didn't want. I don't know if you've seen that in people as well.
Absolutely. And like justifying and rationalizing, or people who do that around vulnerability, like they're scared to be vulnerable. And so they tell themselves, oh, I don't really need people. I don't do that well with people. I'm so independent. And what happened? What was the end of your story?
I actually like spent 2 months in Queensland at my grandparents' house, and I literally didn't see anyone. And I was so unhappy. And I went back to uni, and some of those people did come back into my life, and I made new friends. And I realized that like I was so much happier with these people. I just had to adjust to what it meant to love and lose in a way. I just had to kind of like adjust to that possibility. And I think that was something that really scared me because before I'd never really cared that much because I was such a, isolated. I just was so solitary.
Yeah.
And now I'm the complete opposite. Like I feel like I really know who I am now, and I am so extroverted. And like I always joke with Tom, my boyfriend, like if I don't see somebody, if it's been 2 days, I will always be like, I have no friends. I always say that to him, and he'll be like, you're ridiculous. Like we had like a dinner party with 20 people on Saturday. I'm like, yeah, but they all hate me. Like, didn't they tell you? Like, so it's a compulsion.
I love how much you're sharing about this because I feel like it's so relatable for people. And, I really do think that it brings up such an important topic about how people will, sometimes justify. I see this with people with attachment styles and dating so long too, where they'll like, they don't want to be vulnerable in a relationship. So they pretend like they don't really need somebody in that kind of context, just like people can sort of shut down. And I'm not saying for anybody listening, I'm not saying like, oh, nobody's an introvert or all introverts need to be around people nonstop. Like definitely not saying that. I just think if we see ourselves moving from a space of like writing people off before we give them a chance, or actively avoiding trying to meet new people or spend time around them because we have this identity or this belief, like I don't do well with people, I don't like people, I hate having to see people in the morning, or whatever those stories you see circulating all the time are. maybe inquire, like, is that coming from truth or is that coming from something in me that's afraid, and if there's something there, what am I believing about myself or people that causes me to go in with my walls up? Because I think we live like a softer and more comfortable and available life when we like have our heart open to people. And I think that it allows us to like navigate situations with people with a lot more grace. And I think community, like you said, plays such a huge role in people's lives. So yeah, love everything that you're saying. By the way, if you want to do a deeper dive into attachment styles, relationships, core wounds, and needs, you can get my book, Learning Love, on Amazon right now. It provides everything you need to know about why you act the way that you do in relationships, where your core wounds come from, and how to actually move through them, and how you can find and maintain a thriving romantic connection that will bring you true happiness by becoming securely attached. All of the empowered relationships you have in your external world come from a healthy, secure relationship to yourself first. And I'll teach you how to get there. The link to Learning Love is in the description just down below. So let's talk about what we can do. So let's say somebody is like, okay, you know what? I'm lonely. I'm definitely experiencing loneliness. And, it can be really hard and a very, heartbreaking experience for people. What are some tips that you have for somebody going through that?
Yeah, so I honestly have a 3-pronged approach.
Ooh.
3 tips. The first is to focus on old friends, to focus on new friends of old friends, and then to focus on new friends. So I'll break this down. The first thing is to be like, okay, who are the people that I already have established friendships with that perhaps I have been neglecting? Half the time, I think that we feel lonely because we have just gotten too busy. People have fallen off the radar. We haven't actually made space for, friendship in our lives, with work, with our partners, with travel, whatever it is. So reach out to somebody that you already know is in your life and has your back and who loves you, and make sure that that is quality time. The second...
Can we even just explore each one in a little detail? Because I think that just each part is so powerful. So that first tip, what would you say for somebody who's going, oh, but Jemma, I'm afraid to reach out to somebody because I've been avoiding them for so long, or I've gotten so busy, or I've dropped off the map, or I'm afraid that they won't respond to me. Like, what advice would you say there for that part?
So I would say I've had that happen. And I would say I know this sounds so simple, and I'll explain it further, but just be honest. People respond so well when you're vulnerable and you say, hey, I'm really sorry I dropped off the radar. I've just had a really bad time with my mental health, or I've just been really, really busy. Here's the thing. They could just be like, sorry, that's not good enough. But that means you're still in the same place that you were if you'd never reached out, right? So it's like, and it means that you learn from that. But I would say most friends, if you said to them, good friends, yeah, I'm really sorry, this has just been what's been going on. They're like, I totally understand. And I had a friend who had that experience with another friend of ours. My friend moved to Paris recently, and he had this big farewell. Recently, it was 6 months ago, but he had this big farewell, and one of our friends didn't come, and he didn't say goodbye, and it was quite sad. He felt really disappointed. And then 3 months later, this friend reaches out and goes, I'm so sorry I didn't come. I was just really, really struggling with my mental health, and I just really, and he was super honest. He was like, I really struggled seeing everybody else's life progress whilst mine just felt really, really still, and I hope that you can forgive me. And then he was like, of course. Thank you for telling me. Thank you for being honest.
That's so beautiful. And it speaks so deeply to, and maybe we'll come back to this after, but I read this quote once. It was actually, I was reading through a whole bunch of studies about loneliness and how it's become an epidemic. And this quote said that the quantity of connections we have doesn't nearly matter as much as the quality, and that quality is produced through vulnerability. And even if we have this like physical distance, or even if we haven't seen somebody for a while, if we can close those perceived distances or gaps emotionally, and by actually presenting ourselves more vulnerably, and that allows us to be seen and heard and known and understood. And so I love that. What a beautiful thing your friend did to be able to open up so deeply and like let somebody in so much.
Yeah, it's honestly quite revealing, I feel like, when people do share that much.
Yeah. And it's beautiful. And it makes everybody else also allowed to share that way. I feel like it like gives other people permission to start also communicating that way in
Mm,
friendships, which then has a great capacity or power to deepen a friendship as a result as well.
yeah, totally. And that kind of leads me to the second thing that I would say, which is you have the first line of fire, I guess, is old friends, and then it's new friends of old friends. So I think like an experience that I see a lot is people who move to new places, new cities, new countries, even all of their friends, move away. And they're just kind of like, well, I have nobody now. Like my established community has disappeared. And this is where I think it's equally important to reach out to people that you already know and be like, hey, I just moved to, I don't know, London. I just moved to Sydney. Do you know anybody? Or to post on your Instagram story and be like, oh, looking for new friends in whatever place. And you will find that people will respond to that and will want to help you out. And like an example of this, because I'm full of my examples today, is one of my best friends who is genuinely my soulmate. I love her to bits. She's actually in Canada at the moment.
Oh,
There we
no
go.
way.
Yeah, she cycled from San Francisco to Canada like
Oh, cool.
this last 2 months. We actually met because I said to one of my friends in the city I used to live in, I was like, she called me up. She was like, how are you going? And I was like, I'm really lonely. I'm really struggling. Like, I don't have any friends here. I don't know how to meet people. And she was like, I have somebody for you. And she set us up on like a blind friendship date. And it was one of the best things anybody has ever done for me.
I love that. And it's so beautiful too, because it's like that even came from part one. Like your first,
Yeah.
you were vulnerable, opened up, shared, which then really brought you to that second piece.
Yeah. So that's the second one is, and then, friends of old friends, new friends of old friends. And then we have new friends. And this is the hardest one to crack. It's like, somebody asked me, well, I was at this thing the other day and somebody was like, when was the last time as an adult you made a new friend who didn't know any of your pre-existing friends? And I was like, years. Oh, yeah, years.
Wow.
And I'm sure, oh, no, actually, we're friends. And I feel like, yeah,
We're
maybe,
new friends.
yeah, we're new friends. But I think in like, we're very lucky because we meet people from all over the world, right? So it's, and we, it's an inbuilt community in this, like.
And I think there's a lot in common, which gives you the head
Yeah.
start, right? Like we both share
Yeah.
huge interest around personal growth and all those sorts of things. So there's that head start for sure. But anyways, please.
Yeah. You're already like guaranteed to get along with like 99% of the people that you meet in this space because everybody is it's like most of us are pretty aligned. It's like staring in the mirror. Like it's weird. But for like people who might not have, might not be as lucky as we are. And that used to be me. The things that I would say is find people that align with your routine because you'll find people who are really similar to you. So in the first, like, I often use this example when it comes to moving to a new city. In the first 6 months, do everything that you can to establish routine. Go to the same gym classes every single week, same time. Go to the same grocery store. Go to the same cafes. Go to the same movie cinema. Go to the same bookstore and meet those people who live in your community. And you will start to become friends with them. And I remember doing this when I moved to Sydney and I did join a boxing gym. And if you go to those, boxing is one of those like cult-like, fitness classes. People are showing up like 7-8 times a week. So you are bound to get on the same wavelength, same timeline, same routine as somebody else. And you're also bound to have at least one thing in common with that person that you can talk about every single week. So that would be like my biggest tip for making new friends. Join something established.
I love that. I think it's so hard for people sometimes to make new friends. Like a lot of people say, oh, it's really hard to make friends as an adult. I think I have a fairly easy time because I ask people things that I'm interested in them about them. And I feel like that
Yeah.
I've started too, because like I'm genuinely like yourself, just so interested in people. So I want to know about them. So I'll ask them questions and it's easy to like build a conversation. But I love that for tips. I love that in terms of like a framework and starting point and middle point and end point, like all the different ways of doing that. And I love the idea of routine because you're right. Like that's how you're going to see people over and over again. I used to have people who would come into my, when I was running my client practice, and I would notice in particular anxious attachment styles when they were moving to new cities and things like that, that they would feel so hurt so quickly because they would often feel like they were trying to make a friend, and they might like get along with somebody in a yoga class, for example, and they have this like 10-minute interaction and they're like, hey, let's go for coffee. And then somebody might be like, oh, maybe, and kind of like shirk it off or deflect. And they would feel so hurt. And I would always tell people like, hey, people have different attachment styles, move at different paces for friendships. Like somebody who's anxious, like if you get two APs together, they're going to click and probably hit it off quickly. But if somebody is a little more slow moving, based on their attachment style, that will apply to friendships too. And so I love the routine idea because it kind of like circumvents that issue.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, if you're in that same class over and over again, you have multiple touch points with somebody to get to know them and to kind of like warm up to them, vet them. And then it's only a matter of time before like you see where those real connections really lie.
Yeah, exactly. And it also is just like, it doesn't make it feel like it's artificial. It's not like I'm just so desperate for a friend, I'm going to choose like anyone on the street. It's like, no, you are putting you're putting in work. And I know that sounds so strange, but it's like you're putting in like an investment.
Yeah.
Instead of just being like wanting the intensity of a new friendship, you're like, no, like I'm actually going to establish a common experience with somebody that sometimes it's really hard to get as an adult when you're outside of school.
I agree so much. You're kind of replicating. It's funny because a lot of people make friends like in school growing up and then keep those friends. But it's like because you have so much routine in that, you have so many touch points of investment. So it makes perfect sense. What a wonderful system. I think that's fantastic advice. So let's say that somebody's going through, and this is something I often say to people too when they're struggling to make friends, is you should find those things that you love, those things that light you up to talk about. Because sort of like we talked about, like we both love psychology and love people. So, we can like go on forever and we get along so easily. And so I think for people, they have different variations of that. For some people, it's psychology and personal development. For some people, it's, relationships. For some people, it's, health or fitness. Or for some people, it's always like we have those things that like light us up, that we get so excited about, spirituality, whatever it might be. And I think also investing yourself in places like meetup groups or places where you're going to be around like-minded people is another really good hack, so that you end up like having that head start, like we talked about, into getting to know somebody and having like something really deeply in common with them as well.
Yeah, and I love what you said about like meetup groups. The other good one is a book club. Book clubs are the best.
I love that.
They are amazing.
So what would you say for anybody who may be experiencing loneliness and not even necessarily know, like what are some symptoms they may be experiencing? And also, do you ever see that people experience symptoms more through like their behaviors than through actually experiencing that heartache of loneliness?
Yeah, it's interesting because you can be, the act of loneliness, like sometimes people are like, that's something that we always know. Like if you're feeling lonely, you're feeling lonely. Like the emotion requires recognition to be real. I don't necessarily think that's the case. We can also be self-isolating in ways that we don't realize, and that is precipitating our eventual loneliness. We just might not be ready to recognize it yet because it is so scary. I think one of the ways that happens is not feeling excited by the possibility of social interaction and feeling, we all have moments of introversion. But when you start feeling like, oh my God, seeing people is such a chore, going out, like making plans, such a chore. I just don't want to do it. Canceling your plans all the time, I think is also a big sign of like you are self-isolating and there is an impending loneliness that is coming your way in a sense. And like it might feel really, I think it might be a sign to you too that you need more balance, that maybe you've gone a little bit like too extreme, or that there's something else that you're not managing, not that you're not managing, that is happening below the surface that you perhaps haven't recognized yet. But I think that when we start avoiding other people, we start pushing people away, we start canceling plans all the time, we see no need to see people, and we feel like quite lethargic and, quite tired, that is probably a sign of self-isolation.
Yeah, Very, very well said. And I couldn't agree more. And how do you think like social media in and of itself is playing a role in coping with that? You know, I've often seen people
Mm.
who come in and they are self-isolating, but it's almost like um, social media acts as this band-aid where they can distract themselves with like almost like these drops in the bucket of their social connection needs being met because they get a like or an interaction or they send a comment to somebody. How do you think that's actually perpetuating this epidemic of loneliness, or do you think that it even is?
Yeah, I think it is. I think social media is sometimes good in that it builds those interactions in between real life interactions. But when those online interactions begin to outweigh or dominate over in-person interactions, that can become a problem because it feels like socializing, it feels like interacting, feels like communicating, but it's not necessarily the same thing as quality time. It's not necessarily the same thing as building experiences and memories with somebody. It's kind of like 50% of what is required. And so, yeah, there's like long distance relationships and long distance friendships that can be sustained through that. But I do find that there comes a point when you do need to get offline and really connect in person.
I completely agree. And I think I found a lot of times over the years that the more we are in touch with somebody's daily lives in a way, you don't have to be talking to somebody daily, but if you know, one of your closest friends, like that this is what happened during their week, or these were the interactions they had, or the funny moments that they had, like that really helps you build this greater degree of connection. And so I think that
Mm.
goes such a long way. And what do you think, Gemma, about dating apps? Like, how do you think dating apps play a role in a lot of this conversation about loneliness? Do you think it's something that mitigates, or do you think it's problematic?
See, I don't know. I don't know. But I will say, especially I've seen friends who have moved cities in particular and gone through like a period of course, like separation and disconnection, using dating apps as like a to fill that void. And I always say you cannot date somebody, like especially if you've moved, if something big has happened in your life, you need to give yourself 6 months before you date because that person can become such like a stand-in for everything else that you need from your friends. Like they can become your whole world. So maybe that is it. It's like a relationship or dating, and having all those people constantly available to you is a band-aid over a bullet hole in a sense.
100%. And I think it gives like that short-term gratification.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I always see things through the lens because my background's in like hypnotherapy. And I always see things through the lens of like what programs us. And it's repetition and emotion that programs the subconscious mind. And I just think of people like on social media or dating apps, like unfortunately, you kind of get the worst version of people because
Mhm.
there's nothing that they're held to account usually within. So people can be spewing all kinds of stuff through their phone on Twitter or wherever, like comments on, you know, social media, or people can just like ignore you and ghost you or do whatever they feel on
Yeah.
a dating app. And it's like that's almost gonna, I think, program or condition people how they view other people over time and what they think of people in social interactions. If, like you said, they're not outweighing that with the amount of time they're spending really diving into real life quality time and experiences.
Oh my gosh, again, totally agree. Totally agree. That's so
And
good.
and you get to have that investment where you get to talk about something similar and you're like diving into the same topic. So I love all of those. And is there anything else that you would want to touch on in regards to somebody who's maybe going through a lonely time and things that they can do just in kindness or compassion to themselves, or something that can help them like overcome some of that heartache feeling like you were mentioning?
Yeah, I just want to remind us that person that this is a totally normal human experience. That being lonely is not something to be afraid of. It won't hurt you. It won't do you harm. It's not going to jump out of the bush. When you become comfortable with solitude, and we can train ourselves to do that, to be comfortable in our own company, loneliness is no longer something to fear. It's just a byproduct of circumstances. And it also like doesn't last forever. As somebody who has like been through so many seasons of loneliness, it just makes you realize the importance of what you're missing. And when you do find that connection again, those relationships, those friendships, that community, you really, really appreciate it. And I think one final thing to say is it is so much more common than you think, which sounds terrifying, but it also means that there are a lot more people open to new friendships, new relationships, new community than might seem obvious to you. And if you are the one who puts themselves out there, people will respond to that and want to be a part of what you're creating for your life.
I love that. That's so beautiful. Well, this was a beautiful conversation. I love that you shared about yourself. I love the really tangible tips and that 3-step system you gave for people who may be struggling with loneliness. I think that's something that anybody can take away from here and start today. And thank you so much, Jemma. Where can our listeners find out more about you and what you're up to in this next chapter?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I always have the best time when we chat. But you guys can find me on Spotify, The Psychology of Your 20s, or Apple Podcasts, wherever you are listening right now, I guess. And I'm on Instagram at That Psychology Podcast. If you want to reach out, if you have thoughts about our discussion as well, I feel like, yeah, maybe we said things you didn't agree with. Let me know. I love to talk about loneliness. It's like one of my favorite things.
I love that. So everybody, please go take a look at Jemma's Instagram channel. Check out her podcast. It's incredible. I feel like a lot of our demographic listening to this will really love this channel. And there's some amazing advice and insights and beautiful shares on there. So thank you, Jemma, for being here. Thank you to all of our listeners for stopping by, and we'll see you in the next episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Share it with friends and family who are on their journey of personal development and growth, and thank you for listening. Next week, we'll be back with more insights to guide you on your journey. And until then, keep practicing our tools and strategies to change your subconscious mind and apply some of the powerful learnings from this podcast so that you experience real life transformation.